We often hear that Rome wasn't built in a day. It's a phrase we use for patience, for big projects. But have you ever thought about the other side of that coin? If Rome wasn't built in a day, it certainly didn't fall in one either. The collapse of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding decay that spanned centuries, a story of how something eternal became a memory. Imagine a city that ruled the world. From the misty shores of Britain to the scorching sands of Egypt, the Roman eagle was a symbol of absolute power. Roman legions were an unstoppable force. Their roads carved paths of civilization across continents, and their aqueducts were engineering marvels that brought life to sprawling cities. For a time, to be Roman was to be at the center of the universe. The world revolved around the city on the 7 hills. But with great power comes great temptation. The empire's very success began to sow the seeds of its own destruction. Think about the sheer wealth pouring into Rome. Gold from conquered lands flooded the Senate, but it didn't just build temples, it corrupted souls. Power, once a tool for order, became an instrument of greed. The Republic, with its ideals of shared governance, slowly suffocated under the weight of its own expansion. The transition was subtle at first. Powerful generals, celebrated for their victories abroad, began to taste a different kind of power back home. Men like Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus commanded armies more loyal to them than to the state. They became kings in all but name, and the line between serving Rome and ruling it blurred into non-existence. This shift culminated in the rise of the emperors, a succession of rulers who held the lives of millions in their hands. And what a succession it was. The history of the Roman emperors is a drama of Shakespearean proportions, filled with ambition, paranoia, and bloodshed. Emperors murdered their own brothers, fathers, and sons to secure their grip on the throne. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguards, became kingmakers, assassinating one ruler to install another who promised them more gold. The stability that the empire was supposed to guarantee became a fragile illusion, shattered by constant coups and civil wars. The first cracks in the mighty empire didn't appear in its towering walls or its marble forums, but in the hearts of its leaders. Then came the plagues. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, swept through the empire in the 2nd century, wiping out millions. Imagine entire towns emptied, farmlands abandoned, and the legions decimated. It was a biological catastrophe that the ancient world was utterly unprepared for. The economic impact was devastating. With fewer people to farm, tax, and conscript, the state's coffers began to dry up. To fund its massive army and bureaucracy, emperors began to debase the currency, mixing cheaper metals into their silver and gold coins. Inflation spiraled out of control. The value of money plummeted. A soldier's salary, once enough to support a family, could barely buy a loaf of bread. The economy, once the engine of Roman prosperity, sputtered and collapsed. For the common people in the city of Rome, life became a desperate cycle of dependency. The government kept the restless masses pacified with bread and circuses, free grain and spectacular, often brutal, gladiatorial games. It was a distraction, a way to keep people from noticing that the foundations of their world were crumbling beneath their feet. Meanwhile, on the frontiers, the legions were growing weary. Centuries of endless warfare had taken their toll. The soldiers, once citizen farmers defending their homeland, were now professional mercenaries, many of whom weren't even Roman. Their loyalty wasn't to an idea or an emperor, but to their paymaster. When the state couldn't pay, they sold their allegiance to the highest bidder, often turning on the very empire they were supposed to protect. Faced with internal decay and external threats, the Emperor Diocletian made a radical decision in the late 3rd century. He concluded the empire was simply too large and too complex for one man to rule effectively. So he split it in two: the Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later be centered on the magnificent new city of Constantinople. For a while this seemed to work. Constantinople flourished, becoming a hub of trade, culture, and power. But the West withered. It was poorer, less populated, and bore the brunt of constant barbarian incursions. And then came the so-called barbarians. It's a loaded term, isn't it? We picture hordes of savages, but the reality was far more complex. Many of these groups, like the Goths, had served as allies and soldiers within the Roman army for generations. They were deeply familiar with Roman tactics and Roman weaknesses. The Visigoths, led by a formidable commander named Alaric, had once been allies of Rome. But after being betrayed and denied what they felt was their due, they turned against their former masters. They marched through Italy, and in the year 410 AD, they stood at the gates of Rome itself. The Senate, a shadow of its former self, tried to negotiate. They begged, they offered bribes, they made promises. But Alaric and his men were driven by years of hardship and a burning sense of injustice. For the first time in 800 years, an enemy army breached the walls of the Eternal City. The sack of Rome was a profound psychological shock to the ancient world. Fires raged through the streets, consuming marble palaces that had stood for centuries. Temples were stripped of their gold. Their sacred statues of the gods toppled and shattered on the cobblestones. The people of Rome, who had been told their city was inviolable, watched in stunned silence as their world burned. It was the symbolic end of an era. But perhaps the true fall of Rome wasn't the moment the walls were breached. Maybe it was when the Romans themselves stopped believing in Rome, when the idea of being Roman, a shared identity built on law, duty, and civic pride, lost its meaning. Empires don't just die by the sword, they die from the inside out. They die when faith in institutions fades, when unity dissolves into factionalism, and when the comfort of the present replaces the courage to build the future. The final official end of the Western Roman Empire is often dated to 476 AD, when the last emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But by then, it was just a formality. The empire was already a ghost. Yet, from those ashes, something new began to grow. The fall of Rome wasn't just an ending. It was a violent, chaotic, and ultimately transformative beginning. From the ruins of the empire, new kingdoms, new languages, and new faiths emerged. The fractured provinces of Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia would eventually become the nations of France, Spain, and England. The Latin language evolved into Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. And Christianity, once a persecuted sect, rose to become the dominant spiritual force, preserving much of Roman learning and culture through the so-called Dark Ages. Europe was born from the bones of the Roman Empire. And in a way, the empire never truly died. Its legacy is all around us. In our laws, our languages, our architecture, our ideas of government, the eagle of Rome, that powerful symbol of legionary might, still flies. You can see its influence on flags, on coins, in the stories we tell ourselves about power, glory, and legacy. Because even though the physical empire fell, its idea, the idea of a grand, unifying, and enduring civilization, that idea proved to be eternal after all. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments what part of Rome's story resonates most with you. Until next time, stay curious.